Most people think they know the names that haunt the world of true crime. Bundy, Dahmer, Gacy, the predictable roster of infamous faces. But what if I told you those are just the surface scratches, the names we remember because the media carved them into our collective memory? Beneath that surface lies a far darker archive, one filled with killers who operated quietly, relentlessly, and with a disturbing ingenuity that never reached headlines outside their own time. These are 6 of the most disturbing serial killers you never heard of. Before we dive in, tell us in comment where you're watching from, and please subscribe, because trust me, after this, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thomas Neal. Cream's story begins like a contradiction, and that contradiction is what makes him so disturbing. He was a man of medicine, a doctor sworn to heal, but behind that white coat was a shadow that spread across 2 continents. Cream was born in Scotland in 1850 but raised in Canada, a bright young man whose intelligence carried him into the world of medical training, first in Montreal, then in London. By all accounts, he should have been the kind of man his family and community could be proud of. Ambitious, respected, with a skill set that could save lives. Instead, he became known by another name entirely, the Lambeth Poisoner, a figure so deceptive that he was able to kill for over a decade before his pattern was recognized. But here's where it gets really interesting. Cream didn't kill in a frenzy, and he didn't stalk victims in the shadows like so many killers we've heard of. His method was colder, quieter, and far more insidious. He used his knowledge of chemistry to slip poison into the hands, and ultimately the bodies, of unsuspecting women. At a time when women already lived under immense societal constraints, Cream's victims were often vulnerable, caught in the desperation of unwanted pregnancies or illness. He positioned himself as the solution to their suffering, the man who could help with medical problems others wouldn't touch, only to turn that trust into their death sentence. This is the first clue to understanding his terror. He weaponized hope itself. That's why when authorities finally realized what he was doing, the shock wasn't just that he had killed. It was how many chances he had to be stopped and how many times he managed to walk free instead. Most people stop here, but what happens next is insane. Cream's crimes weren't confined to Canada or Britain. His reach spanned oceans, his techniques shifted, and his arrogance grew so large that it became his undoing. The chilling part about Thomas Neal Cream is not just the murders themselves, but the way his life seemed to slip in and out of crime scenes like a man convinced he was untouchable, as though each new country was a blank slate where his reputation couldn't follow. After completing his medical studies in Montreal, whispers began about suspicious deaths connected to his practice. One young woman, his mistress, was found poisoned under circumstances so clouded that even then investigators questioned whether Cream had a hand in it. Yet no conviction followed, and that pattern would repeat again and again. Women dying suddenly, Cream conveniently close, suspicion in the air, but no proof that could hold him. When he moved to London, the shift in geography didn't mean a shift in his behavior. In fact, it emboldened him. In the Lambeth district, one of London's poorer and more desperate quarters, women came to him seeking treatment for conditions that polite society refused to acknowledge, particularly unwanted pregnancies. And it was here that his poisonings took on a rhythm almost like a grim routine. He provided mixtures and medicines under the guise of help, but instead of relief, his patients slipped into agony and death, the same cruel signature appearing again and again. Investigators later realized that multiple women who never knew one another all spoke of Cream before their deaths. But here's where it gets really interesting. Cream didn't just kill, he seemed to crave the aftermath, inserting himself into investigations and even writing letters to authorities pointing fingers at others, as though taunting the system to notice him. This arrogance created an open loop that London police could not ignore, and each death added pressure. Yet despite the suspicions mounting, his ability to play the role of a respectable physician allowed him to keep slipping past scrutiny. The city of London became a stage for his poisons. And Lambeth, already weighed down by poverty and illness, turned into his hunting ground, its women unknowingly placing their lives in the hands of a man who treated murder as though it were an intellectual puzzle. And just when the authorities began circling closer, Cream's story took a turn across the ocean once again, opening a new chapter that most killers could never dream of. A chance to disappear entirely and begin the pattern anew. The unraveling of Thomas Neal Cream's story is as unsettling as the killings themselves, because it reveals how arrogance can sometimes expose what meticulous planning conceals. By the late 1880s and early 1890s, London authorities were under pressure to explain why young women kept dying after encounters with this doctor. Cream's poisons were difficult to trace, often dismissed as natural illness or complications from crude medical procedures, but his own behavior began drawing unwanted light. He wrote anonymous letters accusing other men of crimes he himself committed. He sought out grieving families under the guise of concern, and he even tried to blackmail prominent figures by claiming they were responsible for the deaths. These reckless moves created the trail of suspicion that finally snapped the net around him. But here's where it gets insane. When Cream was arrested and brought to trial in 1892, the sheer scale of his crimes began to emerge in fragments. Witnesses connected him to multiple deaths, not just in London, but also in Canada and the United States, suggesting that his true victim count may never be known. The press dubbed him the Lambeth Poisoner, and the nickname stuck because it captured both the place and the method, but it failed to capture the scope of what he'd done. During sentencing, Cream was almost casual, as though convinced his intelligence and status as a doctor would shield him from the gallows. And then came the final twist that has haunted historians ever since. As the trapdoor opened beneath him at his execution, he allegedly uttered the words, "I am Jack the," before the rope snapped his neck. Whether it was a macabre joke, a desperate grab for notoriety, or a hint at a connection to the infamous Ripper murders, no one will ever know. What we do know is that Cream died with secrets still buried, leaving behind a legacy of manipulation, poison, and arrogance that thrived in the blind spots of Victorian society. His case was a warning of how killers could hide in plain sight, dressed not as monsters, but as men of respect. And as his story faded from headlines, a new generation of predators was already preparing to step into history's shadows. When the rope snapped beneath Thomas Neal Cream in 1892, it seemed as if London had finally silenced one of the most manipulative killers in history. But if society thought the era of quiet, calculating predators had ended there, they were gravely mistaken. The unsettling truth is that killers often emerge like echoes, one case bleeding into the next, as though history itself refuses to stay clean. Just 3 decades later, on the other side of the Atlantic, North America would be stalked by a figure so terrifying that newspapers struggled to describe him, finally resorting to calling him the Gorilla Killer. His name was Earl Leonard Nelson, and unlike Cream, whose weapon was poison and deception, Nelson's terror was physical, raw, and unpredictable. Born in 1897 in Philadelphia, Nelson's early life already carried signs of brokenness. Orphaned young and raised by a strict religious grandmother, his childhood was marked by illness, isolation, and disturbing behavior that went unchecked. He suffered a severe head injury at age 10 after being struck by a car, and from that moment on, his mental instability seemed to deepen. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Instead of fitting into society's molds as he grew older, Nelson became increasingly detached, drifting between cities and jobs. often described by those who encountered him as both quiet and oddly unsettling. By the mid-1920s, as the world recovered from war and economic collapse, Nelson was wandering North America under a cloak of anonymity, carrying with him a darkness that would soon erupt into one of the most bizarre killing sprees in history. His victims were often landladies, women who rented rooms in their homes, respectable, ordinary, and unprepared for the nightmare that would arrive at their doors. And unlike Cream, who lulled his victims with medicine and promises, Nelson's method was brutal and direct. He entered their homes under the pretense of being a tenant, and what followed was sudden violence that left families shattered and communities in shock. Each city he passed through became another shadowed mark on his trail, and yet, like Cream, his movements were so fast and his disguises so simple that authorities struggled to link the crimes together. What began as isolated tragedies soon formed a pattern so chilling that even hardened detectives admitted they had never seen anything like it. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Nelson didn't stop after a handful of murders. His spree stretched across the United States and into Canada, leaving nearly 24 women dead in his wake before the chase finally caught up to him. The nightmare of Earl Leonard Nelson deepened once investigators began to realize that the deaths of landladies across different states were not random tragedies, but the work of one roaming predator whose face no one could quite remember and whose name slipped like smoke through every community he passed. In the mid-1920s, America was still reeling from the turbulence of war and economic strain, but there was also a cultural shift happening. Cities were growing, more people were renting rooms, and women, particularly widows and single matrons, often took in boarders to survive financially. Nelson exploited this vulnerability with chilling precision, presenting himself as a polite, if slightly odd young man in need of lodging, often carrying a Bible or speaking with a soft voice that disarmed suspicion. But once inside, behind closed doors, his true nature emerged. Sudden bursts of violence that shocked even seasoned detectives when they pieced together the crime scenes. Bodies were found strangled, rooms overturned, and always the same pattern of a trusted stranger turning into an unstoppable force. Yet what makes Nelson's spree so terrifying is not just the brutality, but the speed and scale. He didn't linger in one city. He drifted like a ghost across America and Canada, leaving bodies in San Francisco, Philadelphia, Detroit, Portland, Winnipeg, and many towns in between. Police forces at the time were not interconnected the way they are now. There were no federal databases, no streamlined communication across borders, which allowed Nelson to keep moving, always one step ahead, always starting fresh. Each new city thought they were facing a tragic but isolated case, never suspecting that the same man had already left carnage behind hundreds of miles away. But here's where it gets really interesting. Nelson seemed to thrive on the chase, almost daring authorities to catch him, even as his crimes drew more and more attention in newspapers. Witnesses described him as oddly forgettable, with a stocky build and dark, piercing eyes, yet no one could pin down his appearance long enough to create an accurate profile. He was like a shadow given flesh, ordinary enough to slip through crowds, but monstrous enough to leave terror wherever he settled. And as the body count rose into the dozens, whispers of a traveling killer began to spread, giving him the ominous nickname, the Gorilla Killer, because of the sheer force he used in overpowering his victims. Communities lived in fear, women stopped renting rooms, and entire neighborhoods became gripped by the paranoia that any stranger asking for lodging might be the monster himself. This wasn't the slow, deliberate poisonings of Thomas Neal Cream. This was a storm tearing across the continent, unpredictable and devastating, and yet somehow always vanishing before justice could catch up. Nelson's ability to blend in was his greatest weapon. but it was also the weakness that would eventually betray him, because the more places he struck, the more witnesses began to piece together the same haunting description. And with every newspaper headline warning of another victim, his sense of invincibility only grew, carrying him closer and closer to the downfall he never thought possible. The final act of Earl Leonard Nelson's spree was as dramatic as it was inevitable, though the scale of his violence left even seasoned detectives struggling to comprehend how one man had moved across so many miles, claiming so many victims, without being stopped sooner. By 1927, his crimes had stretched from coast to coast, and when he crossed into Canada, the terror followed him north. Winnipeg became the stage for his downfall, a city gripped by fear as reports surfaced of another landlady murdered in her own home. Unlike in the United States, where communication between police departments was fractured, Canadian authorities responded with a coordinated intensity, and Nelson's pattern was now too distinct to ignore. Witnesses described his odd mannerisms, the way he asked about rooms, his unsettling stare, his sudden disappearance after each killing. And soon his face began to appear in newspapers with warnings that this was the guerrilla killer who had stalked so many women across the continent. The chase reached its climax when Nelson was finally recognized on the streets of Winnipeg, and a desperate pursuit led to his capture. But even in custody, his demeanor was chilling. He showed little remorse, little recognition of the devastation he had caused, as though the murders were simply inevitable movements in a life he never truly controlled. His trial became a spectacle, and for the first time the public was able to confront the man behind the headlines. The evidence was overwhelming: testimony, patterns, and the shocking realization that nearly 24 women had fallen victim to his relentless path. Nelson was convicted and sentenced to death, and in 1928 he was hanged in Canada, his reign of terror finally brought to a close. Yet the true horror of his case lingers in the unanswered questions. How many more women might have died if he had not been caught? And how many murders along his drifting trail may never have been officially tied to him? The guerrilla killer faded into history, his name eclipsed by flashier cases that came after. But the pattern he left behind was clear. Killers could move like shadows, using anonymity as their greatest weapon. And it's this lesson that ties Nelson back to men like Thomas Neal Cream and forward to the next predator who would emerge. Because after Nelson, history was far from finished producing forgotten monsters. In fact, one of the most disturbing stories comes not from a drifter or a poisoner, but from someone who wore the mask of compassion itself, a nurse who turned the power of care into the machinery of death, killing not for money, not even for secrecy, but for the sheer thrill of watching life slip away under her control. Her name was Jane Toppen, and her story is perhaps the most chilling of them all. By the time the noose tightened around Earl Leonard Nelson's neck in 1928, the world might have breathed a sigh of relief, believing that at least one more shadow had been erased from its streets. But evil doesn't die with one man. It resurfaces, often wearing a different mask, sometimes even a more terrifying one. And while Nelson prowled boarding houses and Cream cloaked himself in the guise of a doctor, Jane Toppen presented perhaps the most chilling disguise of all: the devoted nurse. Born Honora Kelly in 1854, Toppen was abandoned by her immigrant family and shuffled through orphanages before she was eventually indentured as a servant to a wealthy Boston household, a background that planted in her the seeds of rejection and resentment. When she finally found her way into nursing, the profession seemed to offer her a new identity: compassionate, trustworthy, a caretaker of the vulnerable. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Jane herself later confessed that her ambitions were never about healing, but about the intoxicating power she felt in deciding who lived and who died. She once chillingly stated her goal was to kill more people, helpless people than ever any other man or woman has killed. Unlike Thomas Neal Cream, who used poison as a shield for secrecy, Jane used it as a theater, deliberately prolonging the suffering of her patients so she could watch their final moments with fascination. Her favorite method was administering morphine and atropine in carefully calculated doses, just enough to create distress before snatching life away entirely. This wasn't about profit. It wasn't about silencing victims. It was about thrill, about the intimate, personal domination over life and death. Imagine the terror of lying in a hospital bed, believing the woman at your side was there to protect you, only to realize too late that she was savoring your every gasp for air. That is the horror Jane Toppen introduced into the very space meant to preserve life. And here's the most unnerving detail. She was good at hiding it, so good that her killings stretched on for years before anyone pieced together the pattern. Families trusted her, hospitals praised her skill, and patients often asked for her by name, never suspecting that in doing so, they were inviting death to sit at their bedside. The more Jane Toppen's story unfolded, the clearer it became that her crimes were not accidents of circumstance or the careless mistakes of an incompetent nurse, but deliberate acts of manipulation carried out with a kind of cold artistry. She thrived on the intimacy of her position, slipping into households as a private nurse or moving quietly among hospital wards where her victims never questioned her motives. Her victims ranged from elderly patients to close friends, and even members of the very family that had once given her a place to live. And each case followed a similar rhythm. A subtle increase in dosage, carefully timed visits, and then the collapse of the victim under mysterious conditions. What makes this especially chilling is not only the act of killing itself, but the way Jane lingered at the edge of death, savoring the process. In later confessions, she admitted to climbing into bed beside her dying patients to watch the light drain from their eyes, as though feeding on the intimacy of the moment. This wasn't simply the impulse of a sadist, it was the ritual of someone who craved ultimate control, not just over a life, but over the trust that person had placed in her. Families described how Jane would comfort them with kind words, even as their loved ones were slipping away under her hand, playing both angel and executioner in the same breath. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Jane didn't hide from suspicion as most killers would. She seemed to enjoy the delicate balance of being noticed and then dismissed, of letting whispers circle only to have them silenced by her charm or her reputation as a skilled nurse. Over time, however, the whispers grew louder, particularly after the deaths of her foster sister Elizabeth and members of the Davis family who had taken her in when she was younger. These deaths struck too close to home, and investigators began to see a thread linking them all: Jane's presence. The public narrative of a compassionate nurse began to unravel, replaced with the horrifying suspicion that a predator was hiding in plain sight. Yet even as questions mounted, Jane herself remained calm, almost playful, denying involvement with a smile, but never losing that glint of something darker in her eyes. By the late 1890s, too many bodies had fallen around her to ignore, and an official investigation began piecing together the evidence of her poisonings. The sheer audacity of her ambition became undeniable. She wasn't killing for escape or gain, but for the perverse satisfaction of perfecting her method, like an artist refining a masterpiece. This makes Jane Toppen one of the most terrifying figures in criminal history because she reminds us that evil can wear the face of comfort, and it is precisely in that disguise where it thrives most effectively. When Jane Toppen's crimes finally came to light, the exposure was as shocking as it was inevitable, because by the time authorities gathered enough evidence to confront her, the number of suspicious deaths tied to her care was staggering. In 1901, after the sudden deaths of several members of the Davis family she had been hired to nurse, suspicion finally hardened into accusation. Relatives pushed for toxicology testing, and for once the veil of respectability Jane had worn so well began to crumble. Arrested and placed under questioning, she maintained a carefully composed exterior, but what happened next horrified even the most hardened investigators. Faced with undeniable evidence, Jane began to confess not with reluctance, but almost with pride, detailing her actions in a manner that suggested she wanted the world to understand her perverse motivations. She admitted to at least 31 murders, though many experts believed the real number was higher, stretching back years across hospitals and private homes. She confessed to experimenting with dosages, prolonging suffering intentionally so she could observe, and she even boasted that she had more ambition than most men, declaring she wanted to surpass them in the sheer count of lives taken. Her words painted a picture of someone who did not simply kill, but reveled in the role of puppet master, pulling the strings of life and death as though she alone had the authority to decide. Declared insane at trial, she was committed to an asylum rather than executed, and there she spent the rest of her life, reportedly continuing to boast of her crimes to anyone who would listen. What lingers about Jane Toppen's case is not simply the number of her victims, but the horrifying reminder that killers do not always come dressed in rags or carrying weapons in the shadows. Sometimes they enter homes welcomed by families, trusted to sit at bedsides, and they use that trust as the very tool of destruction. Her legacy is one of betrayal on the deepest level, the violation of humanity's instinct to believe in caregivers, and it is this betrayal that secured her place as one of the most chilling figures in history. And yet, as her story faded into the early years of the 20th century, another tale was waiting to take shape. One so deeply rooted in history that it blurred the line between legend and reality. Because if Jane Toppen was the nurse who turned compassion into cruelty, then Gilles de Rais, centuries earlier in France, was the nobleman who turned privilege into horror, and his story would become one of the earliest and most disturbing examples of a serial killer whose name the world tried for centuries to forget. To step into the story of Gilles de Rais is to step back in time, to a world where castles rose against the skyline, where knights rode into battle, and where superstition blurred with politics, religion, and war. Unlike Thomas Neal Cream, Earl Leonard Nelson, or Jane Toppen, whose crimes emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Gilles de Rais's life unfolded in the 15th century, placing him not in a modern courtroom or a hospital ward, but on the bloody stage of medieval France. Born into nobility in 1405, de Rais inherited vast estates and wealth, and from the beginning, he seemed destined to become one of the most celebrated men of his generation. As a commander in the French army, he fought bravely alongside Joan of Arc during the 100 Years' War, his reputation burnished by victories and his status elevated by proximity to one of history's most legendary figures. To the outside world, Gilles was the model of medieval chivalry, educated, pious, a warrior, and a patron of the arts. But here's where the story twists into something truly horrifying. Beneath the polished surface of the nobleman lay a darkness that would make him one of history's most infamous killers. A man whose legacy would be stained not by the glory of war, but by the grotesque secrets hidden inside his castles. After the war ended and Joan of Arc was executed, Gilles withdrew from military life, retreating into his estates, where he indulged in lavish spending, elaborate pageantry, and eventually something far more sinister. Whispers began to spread through the countryside of children disappearing, of peasants who entrusted their sons to the noble household never to see them again, of strange rituals and locked chambers where even servants feared to tread. What made de Rais's story endure through centuries is not only the accusation that he murdered dozens, some say hundreds, of children, but the way these accusations clashed with the image of a man celebrated as a war hero. This contradiction created a legend that blended fact and myth until historians still debate the true extent of his crimes. But regardless of where the myth ends and the truth begins, the trial of Gilles de Rais remains one of the most chilling in medieval history, painting a portrait of a man who used his privilege not to protect his people but to prey upon them, turning castles that once symbolized safety into prisons of unspeakable fear. And the most disturbing part is that for years, his status shielded him, allowing the disappearances to continue unchecked, until finally the sheer number of vanished children forced the authorities to look into the nightmare hiding within the stone walls of a knight's estate. As the whispers surrounding Gilles de Rais thickened into accusations, the once revered knight found himself entangled in a net of suspicion that even his immense wealth and noble blood could not silence. Villagers spoke of sons sent to his estates under promises of education or work who were never seen again, their families left with only silence and grief. Servants and attendants within his castles described strange rituals, rooms sealed away from view, and the unnerving pattern of young boys being escorted in but never emerging. What makes this story uniquely chilling is the contrast. Gilles still maintained his public life of patronage, sponsoring plays, supporting the church, and entertaining guests with lavish banquets, all while carrying within his walls a secret that grew more grotesque with each passing year. Historians debate whether the charges brought against him were exaggerated by political enemies eager to seize his lands. But the consistency of the testimonies recorded at his trial in 1440 suggests that something monstrous had indeed occurred. Witness after witness recounted tales of children lured by Gilles' servants, taken into hidden chambers, and never returned to their families, the cries of the innocent echoing through stone corridors that had once been symbols of chivalry and faith. Here's where it gets even darker. Gilles, when confronted with mounting evidence, reportedly confessed in excruciating detail, admitting to acts that horrified even hardened inquisitors of the 15th century. Some accounts suggest his victims numbered in the hundreds, though even the lower estimates are staggering. What remains beyond debate is that he was a predator who exploited both his position and the blind trust of those who believed nobility carried with it an obligation of protection. Instead, Gilles de Rais twisted his power into license, demonstrating how unchecked privilege can breed horrors greater than those of any battlefield. The juxtaposition of his valor alongside Joan of Arc with the atrocities he later confessed to committing created a rift in the narrative of medieval heroism, leaving posterity unsure how to reconcile the two faces of the same man. Was Gilles a war hero corrupted by the emptiness of peacetime, or was the darkness always there, masked by the chaos of war and revealed only once the swords were sheathed? Whatever the answer, his trial became a spectacle, one that riveted France and ensured his name would survive, not as a hero, but as one of the earliest recorded serial killers in Western history. His castles were searched, his servants interrogated, and the grim puzzle of the missing children finally began to take shape, leading to a verdict that would strip away his noble title and condemn him to the same fate he had inflicted on so many others. The downfall of Gilles de Rais was as swift as it was dramatic, a collapse from celebrated knight to condemned criminal that played out in front of both clergy and crown, cementing his legacy not in the glory of battle, but in the infamy of atrocity. In 1440, after months of investigation and damning testimony, de Rais was brought before ecclesiastical and secular courts, where the full weight of his alleged crimes was laid bare. The trial transcripts, preserved through centuries, reveal a procession of witnesses, peasants, servants, clerics, each adding pieces to a picture of systematic abuse and murder that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the man who had once fought alongside Joan of Arc. What gripped the public imagination was not only the scale of the accusations, but de Rais's own confessions, which, whether coerced or voluntary, painted him as a man who reveled in his control over life and death, echoing the twisted hunger for domination seen centuries later in Jane Toppen. Accounts described how he admitted to luring children into his castles, using wealth and promises as bait, and then consigning them to fates too horrifying for the medieval mind to fully articulate. His words shattered any remaining illusions of nobility as a shield of virtue. Found guilty of heresy, sodomy, and the murder of countless children, de Rais was sentenced to death by hanging and burning, a punishment designed not only to end his life, but to erase his honor and to serve as a warning that even the highest born could fall. On October 26, 1440, in Nantes, he met his end before a vast crowd, some weeping at the memory of the hero he once was, others shouting in rage at the monster he had become. And yet, even in death, his story refused to settle into silence. Over centuries, myths arose around him, some painting him as a victim of political conspiracy, others as the true inspiration for fairy tales like Bluebeard, the nobleman who killed his wives behind locked doors. Whether seen as legend or fact, the shadow of his crimes remains a reminder that evil is not bound by time or place, that the same darkness that lived in a medieval castle can resurface in a modern hospital ward or a rented boarding house. It is a continuum of cruelty that history seems doomed to replay, shifting shapes but never disappearing. And when Gilles de Rais was reduced to ash, the world did not become safer, because just a few centuries later, in the hills and fields of rural France, another figure would appear, carrying a knife, wandering aimlessly, leaving behind mutilated victims and a terror so profound that he would be called the French Ripper. His name was Joseph Vacher, and his path through the countryside would echo the same blend of fear, violence, and confusion that made his predecessor infamous. When Gilles de Rais was reduced to ash in 1440, France may have hoped that such horrors belonged to the past, locked away with the medieval world and its brutality. Yet centuries later, the countryside once again found itself haunted by a figure whose crimes were so relentless, so inexplicable, that villagers whispered his name in the same tone they once used for monsters of folklore. His name was Joseph Vacher, and unlike the nobleman de Rais, he was not shielded by castles or noble blood. He came from poverty, born in 1869 to a large peasant family in rural France, a child who knew hardship and rejection from the start. What makes his story so haunting is the way ordinary beginnings spiraled into extraordinary violence. After a troubled youth marked by mental instability, Vacher served in the French army, where a broken love affair with a young woman ended in disaster. Rejected, he shot her and himself, but survived. His face left permanently scarred and his ear deformed. It was this disfigurement, combined with his erratic behavior, that turned him into a spectral figure wandering through the French countryside in the 1890s. Imagine rural villages, isolated and vulnerable, with little communication between them, suddenly experiencing the same terror. A vagrant with a twisted face, dressed in a soldier's coat, appearing on their roads, then vanishing after bodies were discovered. Vacher's victims were usually shepherds and farm workers, often young and alone in the fields, making them easy targets. He killed swiftly, using a knife with terrifying efficiency, and then disappeared before news could spread to the next town. The randomness of his attacks, combined with the anonymity of a drifter, made him nearly impossible to catch. Each killing seemed unconnected to the last, a scattering of violence across provinces that authorities struggled to piece together. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Vacher appeared to have no clear motive beyond compulsion. He was not driven by profit or revenge, but by an overwhelming urge to kill, leaving behind bodies in ditches, woods, and pastures, and moving on as though nothing had happened. Over time, his path of destruction came to mirror the folklore of the werewolf, a predator who could strike anywhere, anytime, and then vanish without trace. Farmers locked their doors, parents warned their children, and fear began to stalk the very landscape, making every isolated road or quiet meadow feel like a hunting ground. And yet, for years, Joseph Vacher roamed freely, a human shadow across rural France, his knife carving a trail of terror that would eventually force the nation to confront the existence of a predator every bit as real and every bit as haunting as the legends it feared. As the 1890s wore on, Joseph Vacher's name began to travel ahead of him, whispered not through official channels but by frightened villagers who noticed the same pattern. A strange, scarred man drifting into a region, offering to work or begging for food, and then vanishing after someone was found dead in the fields. Authorities struggled to connect the crimes because each province treated the murders as isolated, local tragedies, never imagining a single killer was roaming across their borders. This disorganization was Vacher's greatest advantage, allowing him to continue undetected while leaving behind a body count that historians estimate ranged between 11 and 35 victims. What makes his story so disturbing is not simply the killings themselves, but the randomness that defined them. There was no clear profile of victim beyond vulnerability. Young shepherds tending sheep alone, farm girls returning home along quiet lanes, laborers resting in fields. The unpredictability created a climate of paranoia, for no one knew who might be next or where the vagrant might appear. Vacher himself seemed to drift in a haze of compulsion, later telling investigators that he felt driven by forces beyond his control, as though his acts were not crimes but inevitabilities. His scarred face, wild hair, and soldier's coat gave him the look of an unhinged wanderer, a figure who unsettled strangers even before violence erupted, but his ability to move constantly meant suspicion never hardened into arrest. It was only after years of killings, when he finally slipped in his pattern, that authorities began to piece the fragments together. In 1897, near the village of Courzieux, he murdered a young shepherd boy, but unlike his earlier victims, the scene left behind enough witnesses to raise alarm and allow for pursuit. When Vacher was finally arrested, what emerged was a portrait of a man who admitted to violence with chilling candor. He described his crimes not with remorse, but with a strange detachment, as if recounting events that had simply happened rather than actions he had chosen. During interrogation, he confessed to multiple murders across different regions, shocking investigators with the sheer scope of his wanderings and the consistency of his methods. Yet here's where the story becomes even more unsettling. Vacher attempted to defend himself by claiming insanity, presenting himself as a victim of mental illness and uncontrollable urges. Doctors were called in to evaluate him, and debates raged over whether he was truly insane or simply manipulative. This tension between madness and method made his trial one of the most infamous in French legal history, forcing the nation to confront not only the horror of his crimes, but the uncomfortable question of whether society should treat such predators as sick men or deliberate killers. The courtroom filled with spectators eager to glimpse the so-called French Ripper, and as testimony unfolded, the details of Vacher's wandering years emerged like a map of terror etched across the French countryside. Each province named its victims, each community recalled the scarred drifter, and together they formed a picture of a predator whose randomness had concealed his pattern until it was too late. The conclusion of Joseph Vacher's story came in a courtroom where the debate over his sanity nearly overshadowed the atrocities he had committed, yet the weight of his crimes was too heavy to ignore. As he stood trial in 1898 in the city of Bourg-en-Bresse, the proceedings became a national spectacle, with newspapers dubbing him the French Ripper and comparing his trail of murders to those of Jack the Ripper only a decade earlier in London. Doctors were brought in to assess whether he was truly insane, as he claimed, or a calculating killer hiding behind a mask of madness. Some pointed to his head injury, his erratic behavior, and his grotesque scars as evidence of a mind unhinged. Others argued that his ability to travel, plan, and evade capture proved a dangerous intelligence. In the end, the jury sided with the latter. His confessions, delivered with a chilling detachment, painted him not as a man unaware of his actions, but as one who indulged in them, admitting to murders across multiple provinces, sometimes even demonstrating how he had carried them out. The trial dragged on for weeks, but the verdict was decisive. Joseph Vacher was found guilty of 11 murders, though suspicions lingered that his true count was far higher, and he was sentenced to death. On December 31, 1898, as the century closed, Vacher met the guillotine, his head falling into the basket as crowds gathered to witness the end of a predator who had turned the French countryside into a hunting ground. Yet his legacy remained, not in fame, but in fear, a reminder that a single drifter could destabilize entire regions simply through randomness and compulsion. Villagers who had once whispered about wolves and demons now spoke of Vacher in the same breath, a modern monster clothed in the body of a man. What makes his story so haunting is that it showed how fragile rural safety truly was, how easily the isolation of the fields and the innocence of youth could be pierced by a knife in the hands of someone no one dared suspect until it was too late. And just as France tried to bury its horror at the close of the 19th century, another story from its past lingered. A story that predated Vacher by decades, one that revealed how death could move silently, invisibly, without a knife or a gun. Because before Vacher prowled the fields with his blade, Hélène Jégado walked through kitchens and homes with a smile, carrying herbs and powders that seemed harmless, and yet she left behind dozens of bodies in her wake. Her method was poison, her cover was domestic service, and her ambition, much like Jane Toppen's across the ocean, was wrapped in secrecy and betrayal. Long before the terror of Joseph Vacher's knife swept across rural France, the quiet towns and parishes of Brittany were already haunted by another figure whose crimes seemed almost invisible at first, hidden in the folds of everyday life. Her name was Hélène Jégado, and unlike the vagrant drifter or the aristocratic nobleman, she was neither a wanderer nor a commander of armies. She was, instead, a maid, a domestic servant who moved from household to household, carrying with her a basket of herbs, a cheerful demeanor, and an invisible weapon that would claim lives silently. Born in 1803 in the Breton countryside, Hélène grew up in a region steeped in superstition and folk tradition, a place where herbal remedies and prayers were often the only medicines people trusted. It was this environment that gave her both the access and the knowledge to carry out her crimes, for she understood how plants could heal and how they could kill. By the 1830s, she was working as a servant in homes and convents, a position of deep trust in communities where servants were often treated as extensions of the family. And yet, wherever Hélène went, death seemed to follow. Families that had once been healthy were suddenly struck by mysterious illnesses. Priests who had welcomed her into their rectories fell gravely ill. Children she cared for developed agonizing fevers. The pattern was subtle enough at first to be dismissed as coincidence or the cruel hand of fate, but in hindsight, the sheer number of deaths connected to her presence is staggering. Over 2 decades, historians estimate, she may have poisoned as many as 36 people, though some claims push the number closer to 60. What makes her story especially chilling is that her motives remain murky. There was no clear financial gain, no revenge that explains the consistency of her acts. Instead, her killings appeared driven by impulse, by a compulsion that echoed Jane Toppen's hunger for control. Yet unlike Toppen, who confessed openly, Jégado never fully revealed the truth behind her actions. She moved through villages like a shadow disguised as a servant, leaving bodies behind but no explanations. A trail of grief that seemed to defy detection because poison is invisible. Its traces easily lost in an era without modern forensics. In this way, Hélène Jégado represents one of the earliest examples of a serial killer hidden not in violence, but in silence. Her crimes unfolding in kitchens and dining rooms, in convent halls and bedrooms, where the line between care and murder was blurred by the spoonful of broth or the cup of tea she served with a smile. As Hélène Jégado moved from household to household, the deaths that followed her began to form a pattern that only years later would seem obvious, but at the time, they were explained away as natural misfortune or the cruel hand of fate. In the small parishes of Brittany, disease was common, mortality rates were high, and few families questioned when sudden fevers or stomach pains struck their loved ones. It was this climate of resignation that Jégado exploited with chilling efficiency. Wherever she went, priests, mistresses, children, and even fellow servants began to fall ill after sharing meals or drinks she had prepared. The onset was often sudden, vomiting, cramps, and an agony that overwhelmed the victims within hours or days. To their grieving families, it seemed as if God had chosen to test them with suffering, but in reality, death was being spooned into their bowls by the woman they had hired to keep them safe. And here's where the story turns even more disturbing. Jégado appeared to take no care in covering her tracks. She left behind trails of death so obvious that suspicion grew wherever she lingered. In some convents where she served, multiple nuns died in rapid succession. In private homes, entire families were struck down within weeks of her arrival, yet astonishingly, no one dared confront her directly, perhaps out of fear, perhaps because the idea that a humble maid could be capable of such systematic murder seemed too unthinkable. When questions did arise, Jégado simply packed her belongings and moved to another village, another parish, always welcomed at first, always leaving devastation behind. This mobility allowed her to extend her spree over decades, building a list of victims that grew with each year and spreading grief across regions that never compared notes. Even as suspicion followed, she maintained a demeanor of cheerfulness and devotion, serving priests and families with the same energy that made her seem indispensable. That contradiction, the smiling servant whose employers grew sick in her care, is what makes her so chilling. By the time the 1840s arrived, whispers about the strange maid who brought death wherever she went began to circulate more openly. Some said she was cursed, others that she was an agent of the devil. But still, no proof tied her directly to the deaths, and without forensic tools to detect poison, the whispers remained only whispers. Her crimes escalated in confidence, and Jégado seemed almost untouchable, protected not by power or wealth like Gilles de Rais, but by the invisibility of her station and the silence of her weapon. Yet even the most careful predator eventually stumbles, and Jégado's undoing would come not through sudden suspicion, but through her own compulsion to kill again and again, until the pattern could no longer be ignored. The unraveling of Hélène Jégado's long campaign of poison finally began in 1851, when she was employed as a servant in the house of a local official in Rennes. By this time, she had already left behind decades of suspicion across Brittany, with entire families and convents devastated after her stays, but without a single conviction to her name. In Rennes, however, her compulsion to kill finally collided with a society that had begun to awaken to the possibility of foul play, as medical science and awareness of poisonings slowly advanced. When several members of the household suddenly fell ill and died after eating meals she had prepared, suspicion hardened into accusation. Unlike in the smaller villages where deaths could be dismissed as disease, in the larger city her pattern was harder to ignore. especially as doctors began to notice signs consistent with arsenic poisoning. Arrested and placed on trial, Jégado faced the culmination of years of whispered fears now spoken aloud, and the proceedings quickly became one of the most sensational criminal cases of 19th century France. Dozens of witnesses came forward, recounting how death seemed to follow her from post to post, how priests, children, and mistresses alike had perished mysteriously in her care. While forensic tools were limited, the sheer weight of circumstantial evidence painted a damning picture. During the trial, Jégado herself remained curiously detached, denying some accusations while offering little defense against others, as though she were resigned to the role history was preparing for her. Convicted of multiple murders, though suspected of many more, she was sentenced to death. On February 26, 1852, Hélène Jégado was executed by guillotine in Rennes, the same device that had claimed Joseph Vacher decades later, and the same symbol of justice that France reserved for its most notorious criminals. Yet her story did not end there, because the scale of her crimes continued to trouble historians long after her execution. Estimates suggest she may have poisoned as many as 60 people, making her one of the most prolific female serial killers in recorded history, and yet her name remains largely unknown outside specialist circles. Perhaps this is because her crimes lacked the sensational violence that captures public imagination. Her weapon was a spoon, a cup, a bowl of soup. But that is precisely what makes her so terrifying. The ordinariness of her method, the invisibility of her hand, the way she turned the act of nourishment into an instrument of death. In Jégado's story, we are reminded of how fragile trust can be, how easily the rituals of daily life can be corrupted by someone determined to exploit them. And as her head fell into the basket beneath the blade, France closed one chapter of horror only to leave the door open for others. Because history has shown us time and again that killers like Jégado, Vacher, de Rais, Toppen, Nelson, and Cream are not anomalies. They are recurring figures, echoes of one another across centuries and continents, each wearing a different face but driven by the same chilling truth: that evil often hides in plain sight, moving through our homes, our hospitals, our countryside, until at last it is exposed. And if these forgotten names tell us anything, it is that the most frightening killers are not always the ones we remember, but the ones history almost let us forget. Evil doesn't vanish. It disguises itself, waiting for new faces, new times, new shadows. These killers remind us that history hides more monsters than we care to imagine. If their stories shook you, subscribe now. And remember, the forgotten are often the most dangerous.